The sun was high above the Mojave Desert, casting sharp shadows across the tarmac of Fort Raven Air Base. A line of AH-64 Apache attack helicopters glimmered under the fierce light, their black fuselages reflecting the heat waves dancing off the ground. The air smelled of jet fuel and hot steel, a scent that any pilot could recognize instantly. It was a day that no one on base would ever forget. Colonel Nathan Pierce, a man with a crisp uniform and sharper ego, stood beside his squad of young pilots, smirking. He was known for his arrogance, a leader more interested in prestige than in people. Standing opposite him was a man who didn't seem to belong anymore. Gray hair tucked under an old flight helmet, his uniform faded and patched, boots worn thin. His name was Major William Harris, though most called him Old Man Harris. Harris had been retired for years, a veteran of the Gulf War and Afghanistan, a pilot who had flown Apaches long before most of the men on base had even learned to shave. He'd been invited to visit for a demonstration day, but everyone knew the real reason. The colonel wanted to make a spectacle out of him. "Sir," one of the lieutenants said, trying to suppress a laugh, "you're not really going to let the old man touch the Apache, are you?" Pierce grinned. "Oh, I am. I want to see if this legend still remembers how to turn one on." The group chuckled. Harris, quiet and steady, looked at them without saying a word. His blue eyes had that cold, calm intensity that only men who had seen war possessed. He didn't seem angry, just quietly disappointed. "Colonel," he said finally, his voice raspy from years of shouting over rotor blades, "if you're offering me a seat in that bird, I'll take it." Pierce shrugged. "Be my guest. Let's see if you can even get her off the ground. Grandpa." The laughter from the younger pilots echoed across the airstrip. They handed Harris a flight suit and helmet, both a size too big, and guided him toward the helicopter parked near the hangar. It was a brand-new AH-64E Guardian, the latest and most advanced model in the Apache series. The cockpit screens glowed green, and the controls looked more digital than mechanical. To everyone else, it was an intimidating machine, but to Harris, it felt like home. As he climbed into the front seat, his hands moved almost instinctively, touching switches, scanning displays, checking fuel levels and weapon systems. His fingers were slower now, but deliberate. He wasn't rushing to prove anything. He was simply doing what he had always done, the right way. "Need some help with the startup, old-timer?" one of the younger pilots called out over the headset. "These birds aren't like the ones you used to fly." Harris didn't respond. He flipped the battery switch, powered up the APU, and watched the systems hum to life. The sound of the turbines starting filled the hangar. Pierce, arms crossed, stood on the ground with a mocking grin. He's going to fry the electronics. Just wait. But then the cockpit lights came alive. Every system booted flawlessly. The engine startup sequence began, and the rotors slowly started turning. Within a minute, the giant Apache was alive. The soldiers' smirks began to fade. Harris's voice crackled through the comms. "Pre-flight checks complete. Engine pressure nominal. Rotor at 100%. You still want me to stay on the ground, Colonel?" Pierce blinked, unsure what to say. "You're cleared for takeoff, Major." Harris smiled faintly. "Copy that." The rotors roared, kicking up dust and heat. The ground trembled as the Apache lifted off smoothly, not with hesitation, but with precision. The helicopter rose, hovered perfectly 10 feet off the ground, and then began to drift upward into the desert sky. The men below shielded their faces from the rotor wash. "What the hell?" one of them muttered. The old pilot banked left, then right effortlessly. He wasn't just flying, he was dancing with the machine. Every movement was smooth, controlled, and deliberate. The colonel's smirk had vanished completely. Then, over the comms, Harris's calm voice returned. "Permission to perform a test pattern, sir." Pierce hesitated. Granted." And that's when Harris truly began. The Apache banked hard, cutting across the airbase with a thunderous roar. He executed a perfect barrel roll, something almost no one attempted in that kind of aircraft. and then followed with a tight 360-degree combat turn. The soldiers below gasped. Even the tech crew came running out of the hangar to watch. The old man wasn't just flying, he was reminding everyone what real skill looked like. Inside the cockpit, Harris felt the vibration of the engines, the rhythm of the rotors, and the rush of the wind. It was as if time had reversed, and he was 30 years younger again, back over Iraq, dodging missile fire, guiding his co-pilot through chaos. When he finally brought the helicopter back down, the landing was so soft it barely stirred the dust. The engines wound down, and silence fell over the airfield. The group of young pilots stood there, speechless. Pierce's jaw was tight. He wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came out. Harris climbed down, removed his helmet, and looked directly at the colonel. "Still think I wouldn't get her off the ground?" he asked quietly. Pierce didn't reply. The younger pilots, red-faced and humbled, avoided Harris's gaze. Then one of them, Lieutenant Grant, stepped forward awkwardly. "Sir, that was incredible. I didn't even know an Apache could do half those maneuvers." Harris gave a small smile. The machine can only do what the pilot believes it can. That's the difference between flying and driving. That line would stay with them forever. Pierce turned sharply and started walking away, humiliated. He had wanted to embarrass Harris, but instead, he had reminded everyone what real leadership and experience looked like. But the story didn't end there. Because what Harris did next would change everything. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, Harris sat quietly in the hangar, sipping from a bottle of water. He thought he was done for the day, but he wasn't. Lieutenant Grant approached him, nervous but curious. "Sir, permission to ask something?" "Go ahead, son. Why did you retire? You fly better than anyone I've ever seen." Harris's smile faded a little. "Because I stopped believing the people in charge still cared about why we flew." Grant frowned. I mean, Harris said softly, "somewhere along the way, it stopped being about protecting people, and started being about promotions." The young man fell silent. Before they could speak further, Colonel Pierce reappeared, red-faced, holding a clipboard. "Major Harris," he said stiffly, "Command wants to see what you just did again. They think it was some kind of setup. No one believes you flew that Apache manually." Harris looked up, eyes steady. "Then they're welcome to come watch." Pierce scowled. "You don't talk to me like that, Major. You're a guest here." Harris stood slowly, meeting his gaze. "With all due respect, Colonel, I earned the right to speak the truth. You just borrowed the uniform." That line hit like a slap. The entire hangar went silent. Pierce's hand clenched around the clipboard, but he said nothing. He simply turned on his heel and walked out. That night, word of Harris's flight spread across the base like wildfire. Videos of his maneuvers were shared among pilots, engineers, even higher command. Some called it the flight of the ghost pilot. Others said it was proof that the old guard still had more to teach than any simulator ever could. But for Pierce, it was a humiliation he couldn't shake. He had underestimated the man who had once trained pilots like him. And Harris, he hadn't come for revenge or glory. He'd only come to remind them all what the wings on their chest were really supposed to mean. What no one knew, however, was that Harris had one last mission left. One that would test not just his skill, but his courage, and would leave the colonel with a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The desert morning was quiet again, but the airbase was restless. Word of Major Harris's flight had reached the highest levels of command overnight. Videos of his flawless maneuvers had spread across the military network like wildfire. Every pilot on the base had watched the footage, and every one of them had felt a spark of awe and shame. Colonel Pierce, however, hadn't slept a minute. He had spent the night drafting reports, trying to explain how a retired veteran had managed to outfly his entire squad in a demonstration that wasn't supposed to happen. The brass wanted answers. By dawn, the base commander had called an emergency evaluation. When Harris walked into the briefing room that morning, The younger pilots stood straighter than usual. Some even saluted him, not out of protocol, but respect. The colonel noticed and hated it. "Major Harris," said General Owens, the base commander, an old friend of Harris from decades ago. "It's good to see you again. You've caused quite a storm around here." Harris smiled faintly. "Didn't mean to, sir. Just wanted to stretch my wings a little." Owens chuckled. "Well, you've done more than that. Command wants a repeat of your flight, this time with telemetry recording. They want to know if a man your age can still outperform modern pilots using the same aircraft." Pierce muttered under his breath, "It was probably a lucky run." Owens turned sharply. "What was that, Colonel?" Pierce straightened. "Sir, with respect, the Major hasn't flown active duty in years. It's dangerous to let him repeat the flight, especially with the new software upgrades." Harris looked at him calmly. "Afraid I'll embarrass you again, Colonel?" A few muffled laughs went around the room. Owens hid a grin. "Permission granted, Major. We'll have the Apache ready in an hour." Out on the airfield, the technicians worked fast. The AH-64E Guardian gleamed in the rising sun. Harris climbed aboard again, his movement slower but sure. As he adjusted the seat and checked the monitors, he felt a familiar peace settle over him. But this time, something was different. Before he took off, Owens approached him quietly. "Bill," he said, using his old name, "we're running a live simulation out there. A mock rescue. There'll be drones acting as hostiles. You'll have to navigate through them. We want to see how your combat instincts hold up." Harris nodded. "Understood, sir." As the rotors began to spin, the comms came alive. The younger pilots were watching from the control tower. Pierce stood at the back, arms folded, trying to look unimpressed. "Raven Base, this is Major Harris. Call sign Ghost 1, requesting clearance. Ghost 1, you are cleared for takeoff." The Apache lifted once more, graceful as ever. The test had begun. 30 miles north, the desert stretched into a maze of dry ridges and canyons. Drones equipped with sensors mimicking enemy fire patrolled the area. Harris's task: locate a downed beacon, simulate extraction, and return without being tagged. Inside the control room, the monitors tracked his every move. Pierce leaned forward, eyes locked on the radar. He's flying too low. He'll trigger the drone's motion detection. But Harris wasn't flying low out of mistake. He was hiding in the terrain. The radar blinked, and suddenly the Apache disappeared from sight. "Where the hell did he go?" one of the analysts exclaimed. Owens smiled knowingly. "He's masking his signal under the canyon ridges. It's an old trick, used to fool Soviet radar in the 80s. Moments later, the Apache popped up on the far side of the map, miles ahead of the expected path. Harris had bypassed the first set of drones entirely. "Holy hell," whispered Lieutenant Grant. "He's ghosting them." Through the cockpit camera, they watched Harris maneuver with astonishing precision. He banked between narrow cliffs, kicked the tail rotor just enough to pivot around corners, and dropped altitude so close to the ground that dust clouds trailed behind him. "Target beacon located," his calm voice said through comms, simulating extraction. Just as he reached the signal, 3 drones appeared on his radar, approaching fast. "Multiple hostiles inbound," said the control officer. "Copy that," Harris replied. "Engaging evasion." The Apache's rotors screamed as he rolled sideways, threading through the canyon like a bullet. The drones followed, firing simulated missiles. On the radar, 3 red dots chased 1 green, until, suddenly, 2 red dots vanished. Pierce slammed his fist on the table. "He's jamming them!" "Negative," said the analyst, stunned. "He's making them crash. He's forcing the drones into the canyon walls by timing his decoys." Harris's voice came again, cool and steady. "1 drone remaining. Let's finish the dance." The last drone swooped behind him. Harris dove toward the desert floor, pulled a sudden climb, and spun a tight loop, an impossible move for most modern pilots. The drone lost lock and shot past him. The old man squeezed the trigger on his simulator controls. Target neutralized. Silence filled the control room. Then a roar of cheers. When Harris landed, the airbase erupted in applause. The younger pilots ran up to him, clapping his back, shouting in disbelief. "Sir, that was insane," Grant shouted. "You outflew every training drone. No one's ever completed that simulation in real time." Harris smiled faintly as he removed his helmet. "Just muscle memory, son." But not everyone was celebrating. Pierce stood by the hangar doors, arms rigid at his sides, face pale. The humiliation was complete, and everyone knew it. The man who'd mocked Harris as a crazy grandpa had just been shown what true mastery looked like. Owens approached Pierce. "Colonel, you owe the Major an apology." Pierce hesitated, his pride choking him. "Yes, sir." He walked up to Harris, forcing the words out. "Major, I misjudged you. You're a fine pilot." Harris looked at him steadily. "You didn't misjudge me, Colonel. You forgot what a pilot is supposed to be." That line cut deeper than any insult. Owens placed a hand on Harris's shoulder. "Bill, you've done enough flying for one lifetime. You've reminded us all what these wings mean, but before you leave, there's something you should know." He handed Harris a folder. Inside were transfer orders for Colonel Pierce, effective immediately. Pierce blinked, stunned. "What is this?" "Command watched the footage," Owens said simply. "They saw how you treated one of the best men this uniform ever had. They're calling it unfit conduct." Pierce's lips trembled. "You can't be serious." "I didn't do it," Owens said. "You did." Pierce's eyes flicked to Harris, full of resentment, then shame. Without another word, he saluted stiffly, turned, and walked away. That evening, the sky burned orange over the Mojave. The base was quieter now. Harris stood by the Apache, running a hand over the smooth metal skin of the aircraft. For him, it wasn't just a machine. It was a memory of every battle, every comrade lost, every mission that had tested his soul. Grant approached him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Mind if I join you, sir?" "Of course not." They stood there, watching the sunset paint the desert gold. "Sir," Grant said after a moment, "you changed a lot of minds today. I think half the base is signing up for extra flight training after what they saw." Harris chuckled softly. "Good, maybe they'll start flying like they mean it." Grant hesitated, then asked quietly, "Do you ever miss it, sir?" "The real missions." Harris took a long sip, then nodded. "Every day. But I learned something the hard way. It's not about the missions. It's about the men. The people who trust you to bring them home." Grant looked down. "I hope I can be that kind of pilot someday." "You will," Harris said. "Just remember, the sky doesn't care how young or old you are. It only answers to skill, respect, and heart." The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of jet fuel. Somewhere, another Apache was taking off, a younger pilot testing what he'd learned, perhaps inspired by the old man who refused to fade quietly into history. As Harris turned to leave, he paused one last time beside the aircraft. He laid his hand on the fuselage, whispering, "Thank you for one last flight." A week later, the official report from the test came in. The results were unprecedented. Major William Harris had achieved the highest score ever recorded in live simulation, higher than any active duty pilot. The video of his flight was shared in training schools across the country, labeled the Ghost Flight. Colonel Pierce, now reassigned to a desk job in Washington, received a memo from command. At the bottom was a quote, one he knew came directly from Harris. "Leadership isn't about giving orders. It's about earning respect and never forgetting what those wings stand for." Pierce stared at it for a long time. Then he took off his insignia, set it on his desk, and signed his resignation. Somewhere out in the desert, Harris was back on his small ranch, repairing an old motorcycle, the radio playing softly beside him. When the evening news mentioned the viral Ghost Flight, he just smiled, shook his head, and looked up at the fading sky. He didn't need medals, recognition, or apologies. He had flown his last mission, not in war, but in truth. Because sometimes it only takes one flight to remind the world what honor really looks like.